My name's Barton Green from 3+, and I'll be conducting a Q&A with the journos after we hear from our guest speaker, but I'd like to formally welcome him to the stage. Mayor Mark Jamieson was elected as President of the Local Government Association of Queensland at the 120th LGAQ Annual Conference and will hold the position until the 2020 local government elections, only 9 months away. Mayor Jamieson is serving his second term as Mayor of the Sunshine Coast Regional Council, and today he's here to address the club in his capacity as President of the LGAQ about the future of Queensland's local communities and Queensland local governments. Would you please welcome Mayor Mark Jamieson.
Well, thank you very much, Barton, and good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to be here with you in such strong numbers. I know we're a bit short on media. They're obviously very busy elsewhere. I want to acknowledge all of my mayoral colleagues who are here today and my local government colleagues. We've got a reasonable contingent of staff here from the Sunshine Coast Council as well. And thank you all for making the time to be here today. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians and the elders of the land on which we gather, which are the Turrbal people and the Yagara peoples, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and indeed all Indigenous people. Can you hear me down the back all right? I was at a meeting the other day and I asked that question, and a lady from down the back said, I can hear you, but I'm happy to swap with someone who can't. Which sort of puts you on edge a bit when you're trying to get started. Reminded me of a Rotary meeting I attended once where the guest speaker was pretty bloody boring. One lady in attendance described him as a 120 kilogram sleeping pill in a blue suit. But he went on and on and on, and the President suggested to the Sergeant-at-Arms it was time to wind him up. So the Sergeant-at-Arms got the gavel and made a big swing for the gong, but unfortunately hit the President by accident. The President went down, the guest speaker carried on dutifully. Before the President said, "Hit me again," I can still hear him. So now you should be reasonably receptive to what I've got to say. Ladies and gentlemen, let me start by sharing some brief words of wisdom. Despite the enormous role that local government plays in our daily lives, the Constitution does not make any mention of it. Now, while I would like to lay claim to that statement, I can't. In fact, I need to credit the new federal opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, with that quote. And while I don't for one moment suggest that Albo and I have kindred spirits, I firmly support the sentiment and the endeavours he sought to convey in those few words. Local government is a long-established tier of government in this country. In fact, we existed in Queensland at least 2 decades before the federal parliament came into being in 1901. We're recognised as a level of government that is closest to our communities. We are the level of, or the tier of government that is at the end of the chain, is most people's view. I prefer to think of that as the beginning of the chain, but we have nowhere else to turn when federal and state governments devolve their responsibilities or leave their posts or drop the ball, and then we have to pick it up and run with it. Yet if I can reflect on a comment made by a former Queensland Government chief entrepreneur, councils actually do care and actually do stuff. Councils actually get on with the job and get things done, while other levels of government fight over who should be the boss, who's been shortchanged, and who can say no the loudest. I also understand that today's gathering is the first time a president from the LGAQ has addressed the Media Club, so that isn't before time, and I'm delighted to be here on that occasion. because if you think about local government's engagement with the media, and I can speak about that from my own practical experience, is quite profound. And in 120 years, you can only imagine how much copy and audio and video has been read, or seen or heard by people right across the great state of Queensland. So I'm glad to have been asked to speak today about the future of local government in Queensland, because there's a lot to say. As Albo rightly points out, we aren't mentioned in the Constitution, the most important document in our federation, and much of what is on our horizon doesn't get the attention it deserves. I say this because no matter whether you're talking about the city or the bush, the regional centres and reef townships, or up and down our beautiful coastline, or indeed, and importantly, the remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities on Cape York and elsewhere. The work of local government matters deeply to the day-to-day lives of Queenslanders. As Mark Jamieson said, councils actually do care, and we do stuff. How many people in the room understand that there's 77 councils in Queensland? Quick show of hands. Pretty good. We've got the 5 largest councils in Australia in southeast Queensland, but we also have some of the most remote in the world on the west coast of Queensland. And a lot of people get confused by the west coast. They think, oh, well, that's over in Perth. Well, no, there's a significant west coast, largely made up of Indigenous communities. But it may surprise you to know that Queensland's councils collectively employ nearly 40,000 people and manage more than $150 billion, that's billion dollars worth of public assets. In fact, it's about 1/3 of all the nation's public assets. If local government was a company listed on the stock exchange, it would have more assets and employ more staff than the largest 3 Queensland public companies combined, these being Suncorp, Horizon and Flight Centre. So local government really is big business, but a big business that must address a range of issues, large and small. Our work can span from providing Queensland's first direct international data and telecommunications connectivity through an international broadband submarine cable network, to very local micro issues like maintaining a local park, dealing with a stray dog issue, for instance. But these are matters that influence where and how well Queenslanders live, work and play. Every 4 years at election time, we undertake the ultimate assessment of how well local councils have gone about their job. There's also the constant scrutiny of the sector by the likes of the Auditor-General, the Crime and Corruption Commission, the Office of the Independent Assessor, and the Ombudsman, to name but a few. Not to mention the federal and state parliaments and politicians who never shy away from an opportunity to sink the boot into local government when it serves as a convenient distraction from their own inadequacies. Then there is the mainstream media, social media, the disgruntled resident who never hesitates to give a free character assessment of their councillor or council. And interestingly, residents and members of our community are very vocal about how they see their ratepayer dollars spent. In fact, they're nowhere near as vocal about the waste and inappropriate expenditure by state and federal governments. Yet the taxpayer dollar belongs to our community just as much as their rates do. This reaction, probably more than any other, depicts the unique position of local government. The extent of our connection with the community we represent is not replicated at a state and federal level, and the reality is it demonstrates that councils can be, and are, a force for good in the state of Queensland. That connection is manifested in how readily Queenslanders express the trust they have in their local councils. Recently, no less a body than the CCC reported that the Global Corruption Barometer survey had found that, and I quote, Queenslanders have slightly more trust and confidence in their local government than the rest of the country, and more confidence in local government than either the state or federal government. A recent survey by respected market research firm Colmar Brunton has also found that Queenslanders' satisfaction with their local governments has increased this year. When Colmar Brunton asked asked why the most popular answer among those surveyed was simply, council's doing a good job. And I hear that often myself, council's doing a good job. I don't need to remind you that the local government sector achieved this result at a time when it has been battling and continues to battle negative coverage, negative commentary arising from the CCC investigations into a very small number of councils. Clearly these investigations have uncovered integrity issues and outright wrongdoing, which needed to be called out. And I don't propose to discuss those matters that are before the courts, as it would be inappropriate to do so. But suffice to say, local governments and the LGAQ have not shied away from the challenges that have been thrown our way as a consequence. We got on the front foot early, and we've worked with the government on a wide range of integrity reforms, and in fact have demonstrated that we were prepared to go further than the CCC had recommended on a number of issues. What we have objected to are the attempts to use instances occurring in a small number of councils to paint a damning picture of local government generally, and the attempts to apply a Belcara veneer to electoral changes that have absolutely nothing to do with the integrity of local government. No more has this been evident in the approach to force compulsory preferential voting onto the local government system. This has been publicly dressed up as Belcara reform. Ladies and gentlemen, the CCC made no recommendation to introduce compulsory preferential voting into the local government system in its Belcara report, or any report since. But what has been overlooked is that local government has maintained its level of trust in the public eye, and that by and large, local communities think their council is doing a good job in the areas that matter to them. The challenges for councils looking to the future is how to build on that trust. Now, we could just take the road of least resistance and continue to pick up the rubbish on time, fix the potholes, maintain the libraries and mow the grass on the sporting fields. Chances are that approach will not erode public confidence, but it won't take our communities forward. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking that corruption, fraud and general wrongdoing is widespread amongst local governments in Queensland. You might also look at the readiness of some to criticise councils and conclude that all must be well at 1 William Street. Well, perhaps these people could take a reality check. Let me quote from the recent report by the Queensland Auditor General. None of the agencies we audited is effectively managing fraud risk, leaving themselves potentially exposed to fraud. Agencies have not applied the findings from our previous 2 reports on fraud risk management. We're still observing gaps in governance, fraud identification, detection and prevention. The Auditor General wasn't talking about local government in this report. He was referring to the performance of certain state government agencies in managing the risk of fraud over the 17-18 financial year. Now, I'm not saying fraud risk management isn't an issue in local government, but we have certainly gone a long way to improving our performance since the Auditor General raised concerns with us around 4 years ago. Let me compare the performance of local government with the state on another important area, and that is debt. There's been a lot said about government debt since the state budget last month, which forecast government debt ballooning to $90 billion in 4 years' time. Again, local councils have bucked that trend. Figures from the Queensland Treasury Corporation show that local government debt actually dropped by 18% in the 4 years to 2018. The number of jobs in local government has remained stable at around 40,000, and that's what it was in 2008, considering, notwithstanding the rapid population growth that we've seen. A sure sign, I believe, that councils are improving their productivity and value to their ratepayers. Contrast that with the massive growth we've seen in state bureaucracy since 2015. The state employed just under 250,000 public servants in 17-18 financial year, up over 3% on the previous year and almost 13% over the 5-year period. Councils have managed to contain our costs while continuing to deliver vital public infrastructure to our many communities across Queensland. Take roads, for example, a staple for local government. Investment in roads represented 45% of all new capital spending by councils last financial year, and there is no reason to believe that proportion will decrease over the next decade. In terms of, in dollar terms, that's about $950 million spent by councils on new road and bridge works over 18-19, and $2.6 billion so far in the 3 years of the current local government term. The benefits of this level of investment spreads well beyond council boundaries, connecting producers with markets and ports for sales to overseas consumers. It also allows residents to get to the schools, colleges and healthcare services they need to get to. That's really what councils are about and what they strive to achieve every day. Yet you may be surprised to know that councils around Australia, and this is an Australian generalisation, collect just 3% of total taxation in this country. That, of course, means 97 cents is split up between the state and feds. So let's just think about that for a moment. 3% of taxation revenue, but we manage 33% of all public infrastructure. Hence, some of the concerns expressed in the Courier Mail this morning. In Queensland, that includes 80% of all roads. About 150,000 kilometres of roads. Now, try and imagine that compared to the Bruce Highway. And you'll all be aware of the challenges we have with the Bruce Highway around funding and upgrading and congestion and so on. That would be a 90-lane Bruce Highway, 45 lanes each way. So it's a significant piece of road surface. And if I can just, in a Sunshine Coast context, most people find this hard to believe when I tell them, but we have 3,000 kilometres of roads on the Sunshine Coast, of which I and our council and our staff are responsible for. 20% of those are unsealed. So this is not something that's a long way out in the bush necessarily. So councils deliver the libraries that help educate our kids and our residents, the roads that get our tradies to and from the job, the parks and gardens that enable our residents to lead more active and healthy lifestyles. Councils also maintain their local infrastructure commitments to their communities at a time when the state in particular has backed away from some vital investments in regional infrastructure. The Bligh government decision to cut state subsidies for water and wastewater infrastructure a decade ago has left a $1 billion hole in an essential community asset. Councillors had to take up the slack themselves if they can afford it, or indeed if they can't, just sweat the asset and put up with the disruptions. For water infrastructure, this means the pipe networks that were first installed soon after World War II are now under enormous pressure. Now, this might not seem an overly glamorous issue, but I can tell you it's no picnic for our communities when the system breaks down, as it's starting to happen, and some of the water and sewage infrastructure in our regional centres. Again, as was well reported in the Courier Mail this morning. A water main breaks on average every 80 minutes somewhere in Queensland. That figure is not proving to improve. That figure is not going to improve until there's a proper investment in that infrastructure. So as I said earlier, these issues are bread and butter for councils and they're challenges that we confront every day. But councils would be doing their communities a disservice if they didn't do that, and indeed a lot more. I can stand before you today and honestly say that Queensland councils form the most innovative and responsive part of the entire local government sector in Australia. And you just have to look at our record. And here's a couple of points to make. There would be no light rail between Helensvale and Broadbeach were it not for the Gold Coast City Council, showing the initiative and pressing the state and Canberra to get on board. The vision of the Brisbane City Council funded and delivered an enduring legacy for Brisbane with a network of tunnels under the city. The foresight and persistence of the Moreton Bay Regional Council drove to get the rail line to Redcliffe after a century of procrastination by state and federal governments. As I mentioned earlier, my own council on the Sunshine Coast is delivering Queensland's first direct international data and telecommunications connection to the rest of the world. And indeed it'll be the fastest point of contact between Queensland or between Australia and Asia. And of course we've seen smaller Western councils like Birdsville, Windora or Barcoo, based on Windora, with cooperation from Telstra and the other levels of government, lay 700 kilometres of fibre optic cable to position those communities to be connected into the future. And the Sunshine Coast is also the first government in mainland Australia to offset 100% of its entire electricity consumption with energy from a renewable source through our solar farm. But perhaps most illustrative of all is the fact that there would be no potential Olympic Games bid if not for local governments, namely the Council of Mayors of South East Queensland. The leadership of local government on waste management reform has also ensured the state will be able to succeed in delivering zero waste to landfill by the early 2030s. Local government is also the catalyst for billions of dollars in investment in new waste energy industries throughout Queensland. Not just in South East Queensland, but in Wide Bay, in the Burnett region, in Central Queensland and indeed North Queensland. We've pointed the way and helped guide the state down the road. Our own LGAQ, an association, the representative body for local government, is also rolling out innovative projects which enable our member councils to save millions of dollars in electricity costs, fleet management and so on. We're also using the power of big data to ensure we better engage with our communities. The federal election results showed that traditional means of measuring community sentiments are not working. Like many of you in the media industry, local government has had to renew its thinking about what interests and what engages our communities. Like you, we're not relying on gut instinct to connect with communities anymore. Big data holds the key to really engaging with Queenslanders and helping them achieve their aspirations. So unlocking the stories that data holds will be a big part of the future of local government, a future that Queensland councils have grasped with determination so that our communities prosper and can improve the livability now and for generations to come. Ladies and gentlemen, I haven't seen anyone get up with a gavel yet, but I think I might be ready just to wrap up. So I want to say to you, thank you very much for coming here today. I hope I've helped you understand the story of local government in Queensland a little better and indeed the opportunities for the future. And I'm going to leave you with a quote from a former media giant in an Australian context or in a world context, Sir Anthony O'Reilly, who I worked for in my days at APN. And Sir Anthony once said, if you do a good job, Mark, you'll always be remembered. And if you do a bad job, you'll never be forgotten. So keep up the good work.
Thanks, Mark. If you want to take the seat to the right there. Thank you very much, Mayor, for that. I'm exhausted after hearing everything that you've done and local government is doing. I must ask one question on all that basis of all of that. You're in your second term. Are you going to go around again? It sounds like hard work.
Well, that's a very good question to start with, isn't it? I guess my response to that is that it's 270 days to the next election, and I reckon it's a bit early to start the campaign now.
Are you a politician? Yeah.
Well, no, actually, I think that's one of the great distinctions. I mean, politician sort of suggests politics, parties and the like. Like most mayors and councillors, I'm vehemently independent. What's important for me is to deliver for my community. And whilst you've got to be able to deal with who's ever in government on any particular point in time, I actually see myself more as a business and community leader than I do as a politician.
Spoken like a true politician, well said. I'm going to hand over to the media in a minute, but if Anastasia Palaszczuk was sitting right there in front of you and said, I've heard everything you have to say, Mark, ask me and I will grant you whatever you wish, what would you ask her for?
Well, I've got to think of that in an LGAQ context. I think the most outstanding thing the Premier could do right at the moment is to make her support for the 2032 Olympic Games absolutely apparent. My sense is that the community is very supportive. The federal government's very supportive. The Council of Mayors have done all the early heavy lifting. Clearly we need the state to be involved. But everybody needs to understand, including those gathered here today, that it will only be successful if we have all three levels of government and the private sector committed around the purpose. And the long-term purpose is about the legacy that the Games would leave us in terms of transportation, particularly road and rail, in terms of digital connectivity, our reputation around the world, and clearly, bringing forward vital infrastructure that we need now before 2032 rather than 2042. So that requires... And that does require all levels of government to work together. Again, the city deal is in place for South East Queensland. There's a bit of foot dragging going on around that. We need to be dedicated and determined to utilising those opportunities for the best outcomes for this region.
I might just ask for a show of hands. Who thinks it worthwhile that Brisbane, Greater Brisbane or Queensland goes for the 2032 Olympic Games?
It's SEQ. SEQ is the...
Depending who you talk to in government. So it's about 80% of the room. Okay, we'll let the Premier know. I'll hand over to the journos. Could you please identify yourself and your organisation when you ask your question, please?
Hello. Mark, g'day, Alison Horn from the ABC. You mentioned briefly the issues that local government has been facing with the CCC investigations over the last 12 months or so and the subsequent findings. Given that we've had 2 councils that have been sacked, multiple councils that have had representatives that have been charged and arrested by the CCC and are still before court, what is it that you think has allowed these issues to be perpetuated for so long? And would LGAQ take any responsibility in some of these issues that were raised years ago not being acted upon?
Well, it's difficult for me to comment on anything that's put forward the courts, obviously. But again, I'd make the point there are 77 councils in Queensland. There's a relatively small number. And clearly some of the behaviour has been outrageous. If someone is determined to commit a crime, there is nothing you can put in place to necessarily stop that. Clearly, whenever something like that is uncovered, we need to look at ways that it can be improved. The LGAQ is an association that represents councils. As I said earlier to the folk at my table, our focus is on being on tap in terms of advice rather than being on top. Ultimately, every council is elected by their community and, they need to be answerable to that community. So whilst, I regret greatly the damage what's occurred has done to the reputation of local government, and absolutely there'll be lessons to be learned, and hence our determination to go further than the CCC had recommended through Belcara. Issues like if any councillor has received any form of donation, our preference was that was immediately seen as a material personal interest, and that councillor should leave the room on any debate regarding a matter from one of their donors. So, look, I've got great aspiration for local government into the future. I think there's a sense of renewal that will come as a consequence of this, and that will be good for the state.
And you also mentioned the government's plans for electoral reforms, particularly around compulsory preferential voting. What's the opposition to it, even if it wasn't recommended in the Belcara report? If it is a method that is considered to be something that could increase accountability and transparency, where's the opposition?
Well, I don't think CPV is a solution to anything brought before Belcara. I think what CPV potentially does is politicise councils. Currently, with the exception of Brisbane and maybe 1 or 2 others, the majority of councils are independent. Of course, every individual councillor will have a particular political leaning, but I think to encourage the political parties to try and take a position in some of the major councils would be to our detriment. At the end of the day, as I said before, on the Sunshine Coast, the people there can be confident that I'm making decisions in their best interests, not being dictated to by George Street or by Canberra through the various political parties. So, and the other thing is simply, and it came from the electoral review LGAQ 30 odd years ago, the recommendation that optional preferential voting was the best alternative in local government, and I still think that's the case today.
Hello, Mayor. Jack Mackay from the Courier Mail. Just on that CPV, though, does the LGAQ accept the argument that compulsory preferential voting would create consistency across all three levels of government if it was to be introduced for council elections?
Jack, thanks for the question and thanks for your article this morning. Well, I don't think it does because, I mean, the three levels of government have so many differences. One I highlighted earlier, we're not recognised in the Constitution. We don't have a Senate in Queensland where they have it in other states. The separation of powers exists at a federal and state level and not necessarily at a local level. So there's a vast array of differences. I think it's a pretty poor foundation stone to say the reason we want to have everyone on CPV is so we can all be together. You know, I don't think that necessarily fits. And what you're really asking people to do is to say, you've got to put a number down on a card for someone you don't know, perhaps don't like, perhaps don't trust. And your vote might get that person into the council. Optional preferential voting that allows people to number one to whatever if they choose, or just vote one, from our point of view, is a far better solution. And it's not just my opinion. We called a special meeting of the LGAQ a couple of months ago. It was the first time in 25 years we'd needed to do that. And when the opposition to CPV was put to the meeting, 98% voted to oppose CPV. So, you know, we'll continue to prosecute that case. We think it's important. We want our constituents to understand the issues and recognise that, you know, keeping their councils free of politics is pretty important.
And just on those reforms, the state governments deferred their decision on introducing spending caps for local government elections. Would the LGAQ ever support spending caps in any way, shape or form for council elections?
We've already put forward proposed spending caps to the government. We don't have an issue with that. Our suspicion is that we will see those reforms come to this Parliament. So we don't have a problem with that, but you need to take a sensible approach. In fact, I was only talking to the Minister about this yesterday, about maybe getting some independent body who could provide some rationale as to what would be a reasonable spend. And I'm happy to tell you, in my two campaigns as Mayor, I've spent about $170,000 per campaign. That's about $1 per voter. Go and stand on the polling booths at any given time and listen to the number of people who roll up to say, I don't understand what these people stand for. You know, I don't understand their policies. I don't understand what it is they're going to do. So, you know, we've got a responsibility to help inform people. Nobody else is going to do it. If you don't do it as a candidate, the government's not going to pay for it. The council's not going to pay for it. So I think we just need to be careful we don't, in our efforts to be, you know, fair and equitable, we eliminate really good people who are the sort of leaders we want.
And you were talking about the shortfall in water infrastructure before. Would you like to see the state government restore some of the subsidies that they cut in 2009, or for the state and federal governments to stump up more money for that water infrastructure?
Well, clearly it's critical infrastructure, and the rules under which it was laid have changed, putting more onus back on councils. So, you know, we need to find a solution, and I think we need to be inventive in our thinking. It's not just about doing what we've always done. If there are ways that we can improve our efficiencies, provide a better service to the people we represent, give them more certainty into the future, and perhaps, you know, even build some new business opportunities, then that would be worthwhile. But ultimately, it's beyond a lot of those councils, certainly the 17 Indigenous councils, you know, the 20-odd rural and remote councils that also have a very, very low rate base. They just haven't got the resources for it.
I might just ask a question. There's nothing more frustrating than getting home and turning the tap on and it doesn't run, or switching the light on and it doesn't come on. If there isn't a substantial improvement in what you've identified today with the water and sewage infrastructure, what's it going to look like in Queensland in the next 10 years?
Well, it won't take 10 years. I mean, we're on that cliff now, and that's why LGAQ, on behalf of its membership, has been advocating so determinedly on this issue. Again, from the conversations with the Minister yesterday, I think there's some common ground emerging. but a long way to go in terms of finalising that. Our biggest concern as an association of councils is the potential health issues that come from these irregularities in our system, or this failing system. And that's what the citizens of our communities and our state will be most interested in. It's to know that when they turn the tap on, what's coming out from that tap is healthy.
Hello, Ellen Marie Elliott here from Quest Community News. Many South East Queensland councils, unlike Brisbane City Council, do not provide itemised spending for their projects and programs in their annual budgets. Should all councils be required to detail their spends on individual projects and programs to improve transparency for ratepayers?
Look, I think we would be interested in providing as much transparency as possible. Clearly, we have to adhere to the Auditor General recommendations and instructions in relation to how those budgets and reports are detailed. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't be fearful of demonstrating to people where the money's being spent. In fact, you know, I'm happy when we bring down our budget, as we did a fortnight or so ago, to make it very clear to people and how we intend to spend that money, and more importantly, what benefits that provides for them. As I said earlier, we've got federal and state governments that, you know, have sort of deserted their post in certain areas, particularly around economic development. So South East Queensland councils in particular, and other large councils, are very active in trying to develop, you know, improved economic conditions in their regions, in their communities, so that, you know, we don't see a flood of youngsters leaving the regions and heading into the city necessarily. So it's a good question, and I would agree.
You also spoke a lot about the fact that local government isn't included in the Constitution. Do you believe that it should be, and do you have a deadline for that or a time when you would like that to occur?
Look, we got close some years ago, and I think it was the departure of Kevin Rudd that perhaps bored us undone. The constitutional recognition of councils, I think, is essential. The model we work under, you know, I think can be fairly described as being archaic. I think if the federal government could work more closely with local governments in terms of shared funding, I think our communities would see a lot better value. Clearly, with a three-level system, depending on the politics of the day in Queensland or Canberra, that can have a profound effect on the amount of money that comes through. So if we could be working directly with federal governments, and I think we can, I often say this to the federal governments, I mean, we could get much better value out of every dollar than they can, because we're on the ground. And you've only got to look at the Works for Queensland program that's in place already, where the state government has supported councils to the tune of 400 million. The value back for that has been outstanding. It's created opportunity in rural and regional communities that didn't exist before.
I've just got one quick other one, sorry Mark. At a press conference with the Premier a couple of weeks ago on the issue of the Olympics, she made a comment along the lines of she didn't think that SEQ councils had the capacity to deliver the Olympics. Has anyone suggested to you that perhaps the state government would like to take the lead on this instead?
Don't be sorry, be happy. I think there's some wisdom in what you're saying. As I said, I think it's for the three levels of government to deliver. The Council of Mayors, you're quite right, doesn't have the resource. We need the state to be involved, and the state will be a major beneficiary. I mean, as I said earlier, what we're seeking to do is to bring forward critical infrastructure. Typically, over the last several years, or the long-term average has been about 2.7 billion a year on infrastructure in South East Queensland. That's declined in recent years to about 2 billion. If we can crank that back up to around 3 billion over the next 13 years, we can deliver the Olympics. I don't think that's unachievable, but we don't need... It's the old saying, I guess, success has many fathers and failure is always an orphan. Well, we don't need too many cooks. We just need a collaborative team of people who've got the skills and the desire to make something happen. I won't be the Mayor of the Sunshine Coast in 2032, and I suspect the Premier won't be the Premier. Somebody else will have taken the role by then. We are trying to establish a foundation on which they can work to create an event for our region that would be unparalleled.
But would it have a better chance of succeeding if it was state government-led as opposed to SEQ councils-led?
I'm ambivalent on who leads it. I think at the end of the day, it's a collaboration of government. There'll be things the state can do better, things we can do better, and things the feds can do better. We just need to be all pointing in the same direction, and I guess not looking to necessarily be in charge. The new Lord Mayor and the Mayor of Toowoomba and the Mayor of Ipswich, there'll be a Mayor of Ipswich in 2032. They will all have a view around what they can do and the leadership they can provide. But again, I make the point, we wouldn't even be having this conversation if it wasn't for the Council of Mayors. And I was actually the Council of Mayors delegate who first met with Thomas Bark, and that was over 4 years ago. That's the Olympic cycle, as you'll appreciate. So the indication he gave us in his most recent visit was very, very encouraging. So let's recognise the great work that's been done, but also how much more needs to be done to make this happen.
I might just finish with one last question, Mark. We've got a room full of primarily business people here, and understanding that you can't take responsibility for 77 councils, but you do speak on behalf of all of them. What's the message you want to give to the Queensland business community with respect to confidence we should have in the ability of local government to partner with the private sector particularly, and research institutions to drive the Queensland economy?
Well, I think again, look around at what's being done. Look at the collaborations that exist between councils and business, often with universities involved, and a whole range of peak industry groups looking for the common good. I mean, how do we continue to advance the prospects of our communities? I'll give you a quick example. I was in Croydon last year. Don't know how many of you have been to Croydon, west of Cairns. Well, 100 years ago, when the guns fell silent in Gallipoli, Croydon was the 4th biggest town in Queensland. It had 47 pubs. Today it's got 1 pub and about 250 people. And that was on the back of the gold rush. And they just packed up the pubs and moved to the next gold town. When I came back, it had a really profound effect on me to think, well, here was a town that was the 4th biggest in Queensland 100 years ago. And I sat my councillors down and I said, councillors, today the Sunshine Coast is the 4th biggest town in Queensland. What will we look like in 100 years? And that then becomes a very challenging task about how we present ourselves into the future. So they're the sort of things we're dealing with. I was talking earlier with some of my former media colleagues, and back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, traditional media was on fire, but the pace of change has been enormous. And that pace of change is impacting councils and council communities right across the state. And I think the councils are in the best place to understand where the opportunities are, how those opportunities can be developed through collaboration with the communities to get the best outcomes we can. Otherwise, we do run the risk of seeing more and more people move to the South SEQ, to the southeast corner. I mean, back in the 50s, my family moved from New South Wales to central Queensland looking for opportunity. Not that many going that way these days. They're tending to come to the coast or to the cities. That's not good long term for a state like Queensland that's always prided itself on being so decentralised. So I think there are plenty of opportunities for the private sector, for industry groups to engage with councils and sell that story. I think you've got to be prepared to sell the story to the communities they represent as to why they will benefit from that sort of investment. And you have a big role to play there, as does the media.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank the President of the LGAQ, Mayor Mark Jamieson. Now Mark's going to draw the lucky door prize.
Just to be clear, I haven't got a card in here.
Ian Chalmers from BCEC. Congratulations, Ian. You get the Civil Contractors Federation bottle of Henschke. I'll share it with you after the show. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our guest speaker. Just before we wrap up, please visit the Queensland Media Club website for a visual recording of today's speech. Just a reminder, if you are interested in a partnership with the club, we'd love to hear from you. Grab myself or Peter or one of the team after the event. Keep informed of upcoming events on our website, and I'd like once again to thank our naming rights partners, Brisbane Airport Corporation, the Civil Contractors Federation and Griffith University. Drop your business card in our bowl at the reception if you'd like to hear more about the club. Thank you for your time. Please enjoy the company at the table for a little while longer, and we will see you at our next event. Thank you.